I don't know whether you ever remember as a child having those sort of books that were popular for a while, where you would start and you would go through, and then it would, give you an option, and you had to choose your own adventure. Anybody remember those books or have those kind of books? They were something you'd start, you'd be going along, and there'd be a choice. What are you going to do? Are you going to go through the door or not? Are you going to take the bus ride or do something else? And you'd do those things, and it would tell you, now go to page whatever, now go to page whatever. And you'd go through all those, and eventually you'd go back and forwards through the book, and depending on the choices that you made, there'd be a different ending that you'd reach. And we're kind of looking at something like that today. Because as we read through the gospel accounts, the historical accounts of the resurrection, I don't know whether you realise the word gospel comes from, good spiel or good spell, good speaking, good talking, a good story. And in a way, the gospels are an adventure story. And I want to say today that in a way, they're a little bit like a choose your own adventure story. And this good story is one that we read in the Gospels. And I don't know whether you've ever thought about, why do we have 4 Gospels? We sometimes try to harmonise how they all work together because they're all just a little bit different. And I know it's often something that new Christians or young Christians will wonder. Why are there 4? Why isn't there just one story, one account of what happened? Why is there Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? It just seems strange to us. And, we might be forgiven for thinking that, because Matthew is first, that it was, the first gospel. And there's, lots of theories about why Matthew might be first. But the experts have pretty much decided that Mark's gospel was actually the oldest gospel, the first gospel written down. And it's interesting because it's actually also the shortest one. So if you've not read the Gospels yet, if you're reading the Bible, often we'll start reading the Bible at Genesis and Exodus, and then we'll get stuck in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the thing with the Bible is it's really a library. It's actually 66 different books. It's not one book where you have to start at the beginning and read through to the end. So you can actually jump to some other bits. And Mark's a good one to read if you want to read the story, the choose your own adventure story of Jesus. And it's interesting, it's sort of the oldest one, and it's the shortest one. And it's interesting as well because it begins a little bit differently. Matthew and Luke both have all the things about the wise men and the shepherds and the angels. Mark's just gets straight in and basically says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's written in Isaiah, this prophecy, and then it talks about John the Baptist and Jesus being baptized, and away it goes, and it gets straight into it all. So it sort of begins a bit abruptly compared to some of the others. And it ends a little bit abruptly as well. Mark chapter 16, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Because remember, Jesus was crucified, and because it was the Sabbath, they were good Jews, they felt they couldn't do certain things on the Sabbath, so he was put in the tomb, and they had to wait until they felt they could come back and finish showing their love and care for their friend who had been crucified. So they took the spices to go and anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid his body. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you'll see him, just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. That's it. It seems a bit of an abrupt ending. And some people have theorised that because, prior to the New Testament times, they had scrolls, a big long thing that you would unwind and write from the beginning to the end. And then books as we know them were starting to come in. And Christianity popularised the idea of the book. They call it a codex, if you like learning fancy words. And some people have thought that, like a magazine or something, that the outside page has been torn off, maybe the outside page of Mark's Gospel went missing. And so there was a little bit at the beginning and a little bit at the end that got lost somewhere. And that is a theory. But the fact that it starts by saying, in the beginning, or this is the beginning of the Gospel, I think maybe Mark did just want to jump straight in. And then this abrupt ending, well, yeah, that's unusual as well. But this abrupt ending, to me, is almost as if, well, it's not actually an ending because it hasn't ended yet. This is a choose-your-own-adventure, remember. Presents us with the possibility and the choice of where now for these characters in the story. Perhaps even where now and what for us. What happens next? Now, as I said, these choose-your-own-adventure stories, that was one sort of thing. But there were some other books, and sometimes even the choose-your-own-adventure books were ones that you could get printed with your name in it if you wanted. I don't know whether you've ever gotten a book printed with your name in it, or you've done that as a gift for someone. Personalised story. It's got your name in it. Well, there were some names in this Easter story, and I don't know if they realised that they were choosing their own adventure and what was going to happen next. There was Peter, for example. Peter hung around, even though he was fearful and afraid. And he was so afraid that he didn't actually turn up at the crucifixion. But then later on, he jumped in with both feet, literally, when he saw Jesus on the shore and realised it was him, and he leapt out of the boat and swam there. Now, we don't read about that in Mark's writings. We read about that in John 21. Another one of the people whose names is in the story got to a choice point and made a certain choice, and his branched off somewhere else. Judas. Perhaps he tried to get things to happen his own way. Some people have tried to, be a bit understanding of Judas and thought he was getting impatient with the fact that, Jesus was here to, bring in the kingdom of God. Why wasn't he getting on with it, Why wasn't he doing something dramatic? And maybe he was trying to force Jesus' hand, whatever. But his plans ended in despair. His choices, his part of the adventure, we read that in Matthew. Or there's Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome. Now, they were fearful and afraid, but they chose a different part of the adventure when they got to that page. They didn't run off, they stuck around. They were at the foot of the cross. And they went to serve Jesus even after his death with the spices, etc. Or you might have heard of a guy called Cleopas, if you've been around the church for a while. On Easter Sunday, people will tell his story. Cleopas and one of his friends were walking to Emmaus. And there was a surprise ending in that. Some other guy was walking along the road with them, and as they had a meal together, they realised that that was the risen Jesus who had appeared to them. And we can read that in Luke's Gospel. Or another person who's named in all these things is Thomas. And we read through this story and we find Thomas in there. And in his adventure, he wasn't there when Jesus appeared to the rest of the disciples. And so he sort of said, well, I'm not going to believe until I see him. He was skeptical, but then he was shocked, and then he surrendered in worship when he did meet and see the risen Jesus for himself. And as I said, Mark's Gospel doesn't tell us what happened to any of these people. We find out that from the other Gospels that we read. But my question for us today is, what about us in this story? Mark doesn't write about us, you might say, but perhaps he does. Perhaps we can find ourselves as a character in the story. I don't know, I never read this book because it sort of became more popular when I was perhaps a bit older than this book is, but it became a movie and some people have watched the movie. Who's ever read the book or seen the movie, A Never-Ending Story? I think if I understand it right, it's a boy who's running away from some bullies who are being mean to him. He finds a bookshop, he finds a book which he steals and takes away to read secretly. And as he's reading the book, eventually becomes more and more aware that he's not just reading the book, that the book's interacting with him, that somehow he's a character in the story. And the more and more he enters into that world and its events, the more he realizes it's his choose your own adventure. He is in it. And we are also characters in a story that we might have thought we were only reading. But one day we will discover that we are living it. You might never have read your name in the Gospels, but you are in this story. We are characters in this story. One day we'll discover that we are living it. I love this quote. This isn't a story about a dead past, but it's a tale of the living present. Not just something we read and talk about and muse about. It really is a choose your own adventure book with your name all over it. This Gospel of Mark. When Mark says this is the beginning of the Gospel of God, I don't think he's just talking about this story that I'm going to write down between now and chapter 16, verse 8. And he didn't know that there was ever going to be chapter 16, verse 8, because until like the 1300s, there were no chapters. Until the 1500s, there were no verses. It was just there and you read it. But I think that when he wrote it, it wasn't that, okay, this is the beginning of what I'm writing and then I get to the end of it, that'll be the end of it all. I think he was saying the beginning of the good news, the beginning of the good story of Jesus Christ was when he publicly broke into the scene, was baptized and began to share that God was now here and the kingdom was at hand. And the story began and the story continued for the next 3 years there and then for the next 2,000 years till now. And that's why this abrupt ending isn't the ending. It's just one of those points where you can choose your own adventure. All of that's the beginning of the good news, the good story about Jesus. Not a dead past, but a living present. A story in which we can find ourselves. And do we find them in our own story? A voice saying, go and tell, and you will see him. And not all stories are super comfortable to be in. They're much better to read, perhaps, and think you're just reading about someone else. We might, when we find ourselves in this story, be a bit like these people, these women, trembling and bewildered. The women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The Greek words are kind of literally words that we get trauma and ecstasy from a little bit, actually. It's interesting. You know, the Bible might talk about them being trembling and amazed, which is perhaps a better translation. There was shock and there was delight. You know, the word bewildered is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an unsettling thing. But it's an energizing thing as well. Trembling and surprise, perhaps some terror, but some amazement. It probably was an awful experience in the way that word was first meant, full of awe. And is it any wonder that they feel this way? Because they're not just sitting there and somebody telling them the story that some people went to an empty tomb and an angel said, why are you looking for him here? He's risen. They were in it. This book had their name all over it. They were in it, and they weren't expecting that plot twist. Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified and risen. He is risen. He is alive. And then they're at one of these interesting choose your own bits, where the instructions are go, tell, and then you'll see. And in a very real way, this gospel, as Mark's left it, is just waiting to be finished. Because it's not the end of the story, but the beginning of the story of what this event now means for these two Marys. What it means for Peter, for Cleopas, for Thomas, and for me, and for you. We're at this point in the choose your own adventure. So where to? What next? Which way will we turn to respond to what this voice at the tomb has said? Go, tell, see. What ending might you choose? What would you write? How will you continue this adventure? Who will you tell? Where will you go? And what response will rise in your heart when you see him? I like sometimes to ask people, if you could live in any story, which one would you choose? And the ongoing story you choose can begin here and begin today. Once again, the risen Christ. Once again, there's the option for you to choose your own adventure. If you could live in any story, which one would you choose? And the scary thing is we often like the stories that are exciting. But some of those stories, if you sort of think about them, why are they exciting? Because it's often a little bit uncertain. It's a little bit hard. It's a little bit challenging. It's a little bit stretching. But maybe those are still the stories we would choose to be in. What would we write about? What will we find as we turn the page, see our name in this book, in this story, in this good story, in this gospel of the risen Jesus Christ? One of the quotes I like, and I'm not quoting C.S. Lewis today, but I'm quoting his mate, J.R.R. Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings, in the story there's this time where Frodo and Sam are going on, and Sam's sort of talking, and they sort of say this thing about stories. And Sam says, one day will people say, let's hear about Frodo and the Ring. And they'll say, oh, yes, that's one of my favourite stories. Frodo was very brave, wasn't he, Dad? Oh, yes, my boy. The famousest of the hobbits, and that's saying a lot. But that comes after an interesting discussion. They're going up these difficult stairs, and things are looking pretty grim. And Frodo says, I don't like anything here at all. I don't like the steps, the stones, breath or bone, earth, air or water. It all seems cursed. Yes, that's so, said Sam. And we shouldn't be here at all. We wouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we'd started. But I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo, adventures as I used to call them, I used to think that they were things that the wonderful folk in the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was dull. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered, or the ones that stay in mind. Folk seem to have just landed in them. I expect they had lots of chances, like us, of making choices, of turning back, only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those that went on, and not all to a good end, mind you, at least not to what folk inside a story and not just outside it would call a good end. Coming home and finding things all right, though not quite the same. But those aren't always the best tales to hear, though they may be the best ones to be landed in. I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into. I don't know what sort of tale you're fallen into. I hope it's not too exciting. Don't they say, isn't it a Chinese curse? I hope you live in exciting times or interesting times or something. But we like those stories, perhaps often because we have more faith in the author writing an end that will satisfy us. Do we have faith in an author who will write an end that will satisfy us? In this amazing choose-your-own adventure story, the gospel. I'm going to pray. I'll invite the music team up again. We'll close with another song. And then, as I like to say, if something I've said prompts you to want prayer, then don't go without being prayed for. Find me, find someone that you've seen up here, find someone that you trust to pray with you. If there's questions you have about what it is to be in this story, then ask someone who you think might know. And then as we have morning tea together, perhaps you can find someone that you perhaps don't know. Have a chat to them. Introduce them to someone that you do know. Perhaps talk and share some thoughts about this story, and then go tell and be prepared to see the Lord. Let me pray. Oh Lord, all that you are for us is wrapped up in us coming to recognise that you're not just someone that we hear and read about, but you're someone who is writing in us a life and a future. It says in the book of Ephesians,